Okay, everyone. It looks like it's just past 10:30. So what I'll do is just start with the introductions and we'll get the ball rolling, and hopefully as people join, they'll be able to slot in as we go. As you all know, today's session is about succession planning. The day we were all dreading kind of has arrived, I think, in that succession planning has become, very challenging for a lot of credit unions across the country. It's one thing we kind of hope will never be too challenging, but unfortunately, a lot of things are conspiring to get us into a rather challenging situation in terms of succession planning in the credit union sector at the moment. So as head of the Risk Advisory Service, I've had, a lot of experience over the years with credit unions, 15 plus years experience now, originally on the board of credit unions and then in risk and compliance functions and, as part of the management team. So hopefully today's session will bring everything, I suppose, back to the forefront of people's minds in that what can and, what can be done or what people could be thinking about at this point in time. And maybe refresh and see how we can take a new look at it, maybe, hopefully. With a view to looking forward and dealing with the challenges that face individual credit unions and credit unions collectively at the moment. As you're aware, the CalcuRisk, broadly, and the entire organization has a lot of experienced risk and compliance professionals. We're working with credit unions since 2012 and it's been used by over 90 credit unions at this stage. It's a solution that, helps or aims to help and support risk and compliance professionals across the industry. And we've been collaborating with the ILCU in this regard also in the last while. So that's who we are. You're well familiar with us all now at this stage. Just to give you a little bit of advance notice, this session is being recorded, so it will be available later if we so need it. Okay, so I guess to get started then, this was the elephant in the room is how do we know that the tomorrow we've all been dreading has actually arrived? It's one of those situations where there's a lot of moving parts. The 12-year service limit for directors and board oversight is looming large. It has been on the horizon, obviously, for quite some time, but it is now becoming, a much bigger blot on the horizon in terms of planning, organizing the challenges that it presents. Credit unions are aware that recruiting volunteers has been difficult for a long time, and it is even more challenging in recent years for a number of reasons. Credit unions need to make sure that a large tranche of their governance knowledge and expertise is not going to be lost all at once, for example, in the run-up to 2026. And should really probably be planning to replace is a harsh word, but to, I suppose, manage that loss over the next few years if possible, because you don't want to lose everything all at once, and that will cause major disruption in terms of the governance and running of the business. Also, the level of effort and commitment that's required to serve on boards has increased the likelihood of higher turnover at a relatively short notice. Also, back in the day, even when I was on a board a long time ago, it feels like now 10 plus years, the burden, the obligations that were on directors at that time has increased exponentially since then, and it is something that is subject to a lot more change than would have been the case historically in credit union boards. When it comes to an employment situation from staff's perspective, in an era of full employment, recruiting suitably qualified and experienced staff for specialist roles is not easy, and again, has not been easy for quite some time. The other side of it is that employees are now far more mobile. There's no such thing as a job for life anymore. These are the key areas that I think that we have been focusing on in terms of what the challenges are. I think we have to keep them in mind as we're planning, and this is why today's refresher piece really is about having a fresh look at it. One of the challenges that we talk about in terms of the credit union now is that many more entry-level positions require minimum competency qualifications. So when it comes to even building up an experienced group that you can resource the various specialist functions from, that there used to be a time where you could kind of gradually build people towards that, but now even a lot of the entry-level positions require the minimum competency qualifications. So that's created yet another challenge in this particular area. So I guess, it is one of those situations that we hoped, these things would happen gradually, would be able to adjust to them gradually, but it is becoming a bit of a perfect storm. And fundamentally behind all of this, in terms of the credit union's own viability, is the ongoing increased cost of training, keeping training up to date for everybody, the sheer number of people who need to be trained, whose training needs to be refreshed on an annual basis, or they need to reach certain minimum competency qualifications. And then it's about retaining those, because otherwise you have to start all over again with a fresh set of people. So there are a lot of different factors that are influencing the state of play at the moment. And so therefore it is challenging no matter which way you look at it. So what we're going to try to do today is have a look at what we do when that tomorrow actually comes. So, as with many other areas of risk mitigation planning, it usually involves planning for the worst, but hoping for the best, while keeping everything crossed that that particular tomorrow will never materialize. So for us, it's very much about planning. It's about, I suppose, trying not to bury the head in the sand and actually see if we can make a structured effort approach at how we deal with this particular challenge. What we're going to have a look at today is a kind of from a few of the kind of key perspectives, how it needs to be integrated at the strategic planning level. The credit union needs to be looking forward on a continuous basis. Things never remain fixed, and they won't. It's even less likely to remain fixed looking forward. We're looking at identifying maybe the required skills and competencies to ensure the credit union's future is well catered for. Developing those skills and competencies matrix, which usually includes like your minimum competencies for certain roles, and integrating that then into role descriptions. We'll look at conducting a skills gap analysis, and then at succession planning with the board, committee, key persons. They should be informed by performance reviews, and we'll mention some elements of that. Talking about individuals, that's staff and volunteers, and collectively, that's committees and boards. And then individual training and development plans, we'll have a look at that. And the last part of that element then is recruitment where applicable. So if it comes down to it, do we need to recruit for specialist areas and so on? So fundamentally, to start off with, the big question is, where's the credit union going and what does it need to get itself there? We're going to look at this as part of a six-step process today. So the fundamental and underlying principles of it all are, what are the credit union's current strategic goals and objectives? You need to know where the credit unions aim to get to determine what it needs to get there. So they need to know what skills and competencies will help them to achieve the strategic goals and objectives they've already set for the organization. And then to have a look at whether those skills and competencies are already available within the credit union's current group of employees and volunteers. And if not, a plan will be needed. The days of keeping the fingers crossed and hoping that, magically we'll end up in the right position at the right time just isn't feasible anymore, because the timelines are getting shorter. So the step one then, we're going to have a look at identifying the skills and competencies needed to achieve the credit union's strategic goals. So when a credit union is risk assessing a new product or service, for example, proposal in any of these areas, it should include an assessment of how that proposal will be resourced. And ideally, any challenges or potential issues that might present, because, right from the get-go, at a strategic planning level, there can be a lot of discussion around various options in terms of proposals and various strategies to achieve the purpose you're looking for or you're aiming for. And if you don't deal with the resourcing issue at the beginning, you can end up spending an awful lot of time on planning, and then it ends up all getting delayed because the appropriate resourcing hasn't been put in place. So it's very important right from the get-go to identify whether that's staff resourcing, whether that's third-party resourcing, whether that's volunteer resourcing, whatever it is. But at strategic level, any proposals should be looking at how they're to be resourced right from the beginning. It's not ideal to leave that part to the end. In terms of skills and competencies, there's a couple of slides here. By the way, I should have mentioned from the beginning that the slides will be circulated afterwards after the presentation is concluded. And so a few of them are kind of lists which will be there for you to reference afterwards, that I don't intend to go through every single one of them. So In terms of operational skills and competencies, we're looking at things like fitness and probity, which is obviously even more critical now than it has been in the past because it's applying to a lot more roles within the credit union. Loan underwriting, knowledge of operations, leadership, people management, very important for any team-based activities, and management skills. Finance and accounting skills, planning and organization, conflict management, verbal and written communications. Strategic planning, policy development, problem solving, accuracy and attention to detail couldn't be more important in the financial services sector. IT and computer literacy, member service. Then you have an indefinite list, basically. You're talking about performance management, types of things like active listening, time management, proactive self-development, and so on and so on. There's loads of different things, but have a think about which ones are important from an operations perspective for your business. Then have a look at the governance types of skills and competencies. A lot of the operational ones will still apply, plus things like strategic planning, ethical leadership, critical thinking. And critical thinking is the objective analysis and the evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. And that has to be interconnected at the organization level all through, because there are different inputs at different stages. So it is important that that critical thinking piece is in place. Risk-based decision-making, goal and target setting, inspiration. It's about leadership. It's about trying to move collectively forward and inspiring all of the staff, volunteers, and so on to get the credit union to be as strong as it can be for its community, for its own common bond. So step 2 then is to create. So having identified what the skills and competencies are, step 2 is to create a matrix of those. So in an ideal world, what you want to do is set up a skills and competencies matrix that shows which are the ones you need for each individual role in your credit union. So what you're talking about in reality is that for each individual person, you're looking at trying to document, it's kind of a bit like creating a CV, I suppose, your credit union, the credit union experience for that person, the other relevant experience you may be bringing to each role, skills and competencies. You could, apply a rating from a scale. When it comes to skills and competencies, they will vary per role. And you often find, as we are all very familiar with in credit unions, that people wear multiple hats. But it's important that each individual role is assessed in this way. You can have 2 matrices if you prefer, one for governance, one for operations, but it is important to make sure that each role within those are listed. So, for example, what we just mentioned, skills and competencies there, you can apply that across a scale, for example, it could be a 3-step or a 5-stage scale from none through to little, some, strong, very strong, and so on. You could allocate a numerical score to each so that they can be ranked if you want. We won't go through them, but I'll call out a few examples for illustration in the next slide or two. So really, as I said, we just talking about skills and competencies there. Additional items would be things like relevant qualifications and credit union related training. So it's important to have a clear analysis of what you already have in place for each person in each individual role that they perform, so that you can see the current state of play for the credit union, and maybe where gaps are there, or where more work could be done to move people forward on the scale. So in terms of the skills, competencies, and scales, for example, I'm going to pull out just a couple of examples here, but as I said, you'll have the slides afterwards. So for one of the hot topics at the moment, and has been for quite some time, obviously, is the fitness and probity element. So you can start out for not applicable for the current role in terms of the formal fitness and probity review. Obviously, fitness and probity is applicable for everybody. They should be fit and proper to do any role. But in terms of the mandatory requirements for controlled functions, for example, you might have a range from not applicable from current role through to compliant with all fitness and probity requirements for the role. A midpoint, for example, might be undergoing fitness and probity due diligence process, because it could be somebody that's new to the role or a new role that's been introduced at the credit union. So you can look at similar scales for each of the types of skills and competencies that we mentioned. So, for example, on the people management, it could go from something like no such responsibilities in the current role through to very strong supervision and delegation skills developed over a number of years in a team management role. So, just think about it in terms of assessing exactly where people are on that scale. There's plenty of other examples there. For example, on the written and verbal communication, it could range from finds communication challenging through to communicates clearly, accurately, and in a compelling manner. These are just ideas. You can phrase them as it best suits your organization, but the important thing is to have a kind of a measurable scale that you can figure out exactly where you stand in terms of each person performing each individual role. Governance skills that play into this are obviously things like strategic planning. So from no experience in strategic planning through to potentially extensive experience in strategic planning through work and/or volunteer roles. As I said, there's lots of examples there in those few slides. So it is important to determine where the credit union stands at this point in time. And bear in mind, some will have done this before. There will be matrices already in place. There will be an analysis that might have been conducted. But the question is it live? Is it up to date? It might be a case of taking it out, dusting it off, refreshing it. There might be new people looking in this area now or looking to address this area that have no knowledge that an existing one was already completed. So it is important to, I suppose, to restart that process if it has been faltering or if it has been neglected, shall we say, for a while. And look, it's one of those issues that bubbles under all the time. For as long as I was involved in credit unions directly, there was always every year you go through that process of, okay, how many vacancies do we have on the board now? Okay, this is what we're going to have to do. How many staff roles are changing? Maybe there's retirements and so on. So it bubbles away in the background, but sometimes, especially given the set of circumstances that face the movement at the moment, it does require maybe a kickstart, maybe a refresh, bring new people into the process, have a look at where you stand and where the challenges are for your individual organization and what you need to be focusing on in the next coming months and years. So step 3 of the process then is to conduct a skills gap analysis. And that's basically aimed at identifying what could be missing, what's in short supply, and what you need to be focused on for strong succession planning. The gap analysis will help again to maybe focus the mind, put a bit of direction on it, get everybody rowing in the same direction, make sure that we can kind of see, I suppose, a goal and a target that we're trying to fulfill. So when it comes to the skills gap analysis itself, it's simply a business tool to assess the skill set of an organization at a point in time, and basically to kind of identify where the focus should be, where there is room for improvement, and give a bit of direction as to how we're going to get there. So, for example, fitness and probity is mandatory for many roles now, and we need to kind of assess where current state of play is and where we need to get to, or where you might need to be building in some extra work. So the first part of the skills gap analysis is to define the skills and competencies that the credit union needs to be able to complete the tasks that it has determined based on its own business model and its strategic plan, why, what it will need to get to where it wants to go. Step 1 slides that we've already addressed cover that first part of the skills gap analysis. Second part is to document those skills and competencies, and for all of those currently performing the various credit union roles in the skills inventory. That's step 2 that we've just covered. So you'll see step 2 in the step 2 slides. Step 3 of a skills gap analysis is to compare the current levels to the set of requirements to identify the gaps. So that's simply comparing where we'd like to be with where we are and making sure that we have a plan then to fill those gaps. So the plan to remedy is usually done with the assistance of others. It can be the management team to start with. You can have the nomination committee if it's relation to the governance side of the house. There's often, you'll need the assistance of maybe training professionals to identify what can be done to address the the gaps in particular areas. Some of them will be minor and can be addressed through, maybe short, easy programs. Others will require a bit more effort, a bit of a longer run up to the development cycle. The other side of it is that you maybe need to approach people, determine their level of willingness or interest in developing along those lines. So it will not be a quick exercise. It takes time to do this, and it has to be done carefully and methodically. So it is important that we take those steps. The last piece then in the skills analysis is to use it to inform the credit union's volunteer or employee recruitment plans. There's absolutely no point in doing it unless it's actually going to inform how you approach the next and final key element, the recruitment process. And by the same token, if you look at it the opposite way around, how do you even begin a recruitment process if you don't know what you're looking for? So, and I will say, I know, we've all been there. It gets to the point where you're almost thinking, I don't care what skills and competence they have. I just need people. We'll train them, we'll develop them. But you still need to have an understanding of where you want to train them, what you want to develop them in, and it will help when you're actually, looking at individuals. And especially if we're in an ideal situation where we have to make choices between individuals or between selection processes. So it is very important that we understand and have done the work in steps 1 to 4 before we go ahead then with our volunteer and employee recruitment plans. So that's the skills gap analysis part done. So step 4 then becomes documenting your succession plan. And, I can't stress that piece enough. You need to have a plan. Otherwise, it's just a wish. And at the end of the day, a plan will require probably a combination, or is more likely to be a combination of developing existing resources and or recruitment of additional resources. But at least you need to know where you want to pursue each one of those, what's applicable. So I know I'm very strong on the early intervention piece. I firmly believe the earlier you get into this in terms of business processes, the better. So from my perspective, I think building succession in from the get-go cannot be overstressed. I think, it's very important to make sure that it is part of an ongoing process, not just a periodic exercise that people do or credit unions do when we get desperate and panicked. If you think about it, performance reviews should be linked to skills and competencies and be used to identify gaps and shortages as you go along. That's part of the whole purpose of having performance reviews, whether that be for volunteers or staff. Staff and volunteers should be given the opportunity to mention at as early as possible time their plans for scheduled or early retirement, to exit from roles, planned exits. They may be moving from one role to another. They may be, working towards promotion vacancy. It should be a standing item for everyone on their annual review process. Do they have plans to change that the credit union needs to become aware of as early as possible so that they can actually build it into the process and so that everybody can be part of the solution. Individual training plans should be provided for each credit union officer to help enhance their own current skills and competencies, maybe to develop new ones, and to address succession gaps. Because part of this whole process is to look at where those succession gaps are going to come, what existing staff could maybe, or volunteers can maybe begin to move towards those. And the annual review process then becomes an informing element of the succession plan. They're not separate and distinct. They inform the wider succession plan. It's also important, I think, to maybe just my personality, but I think training plans also give structure and a sense of achievement and completion as each one is ticked off the list. So if you assign a training plan to an individual, whether it's a normal routine every, maybe nothing has changed, but we all know there are mandatory annual training requirements, but having a list, being able to tick it off, you get a sense of achievement by the end of the period, however long you have to complete that training. And it's important that you kind of include recommendations maybe around specific training programs, but also options for people to identify alternates, to vary it up a little bit, to be challenged a little bit more, maybe just to see something a little bit different than they did the previous year. So yeah, I am a bit of a, list person. So I do get great enjoyment out of ticking off things off a list, and hopefully I'm not the only one there. But I do think training plans help in that regard too. You do get a sense of achievement, as people complete programs for themselves. It's also important, I guess, to have individualized development programs, because some of them will be kind of the annual mandatory stuff that we're all familiar with in credit unions, but there may be individual elements that, people can be building up their own skills and knowledge and aiming towards promotions, towards different roles and so on. And I think an element that is sometimes overlooked is the one-to-one mentorship arrangements. And that's not just for new people. We sometimes focus on it very much as a new person to the organization. Here's somebody to kind of hold your hand a little bit until you get your feet onto the table. But, do bear in mind that, I suppose it can be an ongoing process as well, not just an early familiarity piece. It used to be in the old days, I think, called something like taking someone under your wing. So if you've got somebody who will mentor junior volunteers, and I don't mean necessarily age, I'm talking about experience here. So it's about experience in a new role. It can be a younger person guiding an older person into in an area that's new to them, and so on. So it's very much about just bringing people along in a controlled but, I suppose, safe zone, in that they can ask the silly questions, they can feel confident in approaching an individual because they know it's part of what they're there to do for them. I suppose in terms of one thing I meant to mention in terms of the individual training programs is things like where you have maybe shadowing roles, but as standard, for example, you have your chairperson of the board and a vice chair, so maybe having the vice chair chair a board, a committee meeting occasionally, so they build confidence in their ability to do that, so that if and when the opportunity arises for them to step up to the more senior role, that they feel they've actually got some experience under their belt, that they've proved to themselves that they can do it, albeit in a more restricted or limited fashion. Same with staff. If you are building people up to take up maybe a more senior role, either in the management team or just in terms of specialized functions, if there are opportunities to get them working with that person or doing elements of that role in a gentle, structured manner, then absolutely, I think, it's all about gaining confidence. So these are the kind of strategies that I think are important in building succession into the ongoing day-to-day processes. I do think it is important. The next element then is to plan for the succession. We've mentioned it a few times, the importance of the planning piece. It needs to be on the strategic planning committee's agenda for a start, because we know that strategies are proposed and succession has to be built into that from the get-go. In terms of human resourcing, and we spoke about it just in one or two slides back, any strategies that are being proposed need to take resourcing into consideration. Otherwise, it's kind of all theoretical, and it needs to be very rooted in how it's actually going to be delivered. And resourcing is one of the obviously key aspects of that. When you're planning for succession, have a think about three particular areas. Firstly, strategic leader development. So strategic leader development basically identifies certain leadership skills that would be required to carry out the credit union's vision to deliver on it, and recruiting and maintaining the talented individuals who have or can develop those necessary skills. In addition to the development of support needs of directors and board oversight committee, other committees, it's important to analyse the needs of key principal officers, for example, the chairperson, vice chairperson, secretary. Each of those would need to be looked at separately and in their own context, as they usually have more specific development or support requirements in performing those roles. So that's the strategic leader development piece. Also think about the emergency succession. So that could be short-term or long-term. depending on the circumstances. It aims to basically make sure that key leadership can continue without disruption in the event of an unplanned absence of a key person. That's one of those ones where you kind of have a worst case, well, what should I say, a short term and then a worst case scenario where who will step in when the initial emergency arises, who will take over cover for the short term to make sure that disruption is minimized. And then it's about, splitting out the role. Maybe it could be an individual who'll take on certain roles and then others will take on their roles, but it's about planning for it. If there is a sudden unexpected loss of a key leadership role, then how does the credit union manage it in the short term? Then you've got departure defined succession. So in terms of departure defined succession planning, that usually arises in, where there's a long-term volunteer or leader who has announced their departure 2 or 3 years in advance of that date. We're heading along those lines now when you're talking about the legal service limit for directors and board oversight expiring in 2026. So that would be a classic case of departure defined succession. It is one of those ones where you need to be thinking about it in advance and planning for it so that the transition can be made as smooth as is reasonably practicable in that sense. In order to do that, we mentioned earlier the skills and competencies, and I think it's important to integrate those skills and competencies into any role descriptions. So if you are looking at developing out more people to fill certain roles or getting new people to fill certain roles, building in the skills and competencies that we discussed in some of the earlier slides into the role descriptions will really help in that process. And then there's that one we often hear: develop a pool of volunteers from which to fill board and committee vacancies. I have to admit, it's one of the most challenging sentences in CU history, I think, in my own opinion. Develop a pool of volunteers. It's so much easier said than done, isn't it? And certainly in my experience, it's great in theory, it's a lovely idea. But the challenge becomes, how do you do that and how do you keep them? So I'm going to look at that in a little bit more detail later on. So I will come back to that one, if you don't mind, as we get to it. I suppose, yeah, it is one of those more challenging elements. Okay, so step 5. So if you've gone through all of the processes and you've had a look at what your current state of play is in relation to skills and competencies, people, both volunteers and staff, and it could well be that due to the introduction of new strategy or new goals and so on, that you do need to recruit. So if you do need to recruit, you have to look at what taking a structured approach to that might be. So using your skills and competencies from your role descriptions as the basis for the recruitment person specification. It is important that you take that structured approach as well and build it into all the work that you've already done. It's about making sure that you structure your interview questions, for example, around the desired skills and competencies. A method for using that is often used is the STAR method: situation, tasks, action, and results. So, you might structure your interview questions around something like, can you give me an example of how you handled conflict with a customer? Were you able to resolve it? How was it resolved? It might be something like, tell me about a situation where you were asked to provide a financial analysis for a strategy being proposed by the business and how you used financial data to assist the decision makers to properly assess the strategy's viability. Another example might be something like, can you tell me about a project you had to manage with unrealistic timelines? Can you explain how you would have handled a difficult or unpopular decision in the past? These are all STAR-based interview questions. So hopefully they might help you to draw out the types of skills and competencies that you're looking to achieve and looking to resource. If you just don't mind me pause for 1 second, I just want to check. There's a couple of questions just came in, and I'll come back to questions at the end anyway, but just in case it was relevant to one of the current ones. Can you confirm that the board and BOC membership period was reset to 0 in 2014? Yes, that, and that's why in 2020 the 2026 timeline is in place. And it is for both, and it's a combination thereof. So I suppose the only reason why 2026 wouldn't apply would be if, for example, a person took a year out, a director took a year out in between, it'll be the following year because it's a rolling 12 and 15. So the rules are they're clear in that it seems to be quite a hard and fast in the sense that it's 12 and 15. And once you reach your 12 years, it's election for the following. You have to step down the following AGM. So that's why 2026, assuming it began in 2014. So as I say, the only reason it might not be 2026 is if someone took a year out, 2 years out, 3 years out, whatever the case may be. It's a rolling period. So their date may be beyond 2026. Okay. In terms of then, sorry, yes, that's Robert. So the next step then is this wonderful maintain a pool of volunteers. Credit unions have had various approaches to this over the years, been there, done that, struggled with it at various credit unions over the years. I will say the key thing, in my view, is to use every resource available. There's no one way, there is no silver bullet, there is no single fix that's going to do this for every credit union. But all I would stress is make sure you use every resource that you can think of. It's important to remember it's not all up to the nomination committee either. I know they're responsible for the administration of it, they're responsible for the fitness and probity processes, and so on and so forth. But we all know how challenging this particular area is, and if we don't get everybody pulling in the same direction, it's going to be a problem for all. So I would suggest involving all credit union officers in suggesting potential candidates, and that includes directors, staff, other volunteers. Our biggest strength as a community and as members of community is the fact that we have our own individual networks. We have our own, if you think of the pebble in the pool, the circles among circles within circles and so on. So there's a lot of reach if you think of each individual staff member, director, volunteer, and their own networks. And it's very important to make the most of that on an ongoing basis. I will say, I do think it's important to make sure that all staff and volunteers, all credit union officers, understand how critical it is for the survival of the credit union to keep the board adequately resourced. It's kind of habit. We tend to, be a little bit blinkered in what we're doing day to day. We focus on what's in front of us and on the work that's to be done in front of us. We have to ensure that all staff are aware that if we can't resource the boards, the credit union's survival will be a question. It needs a strong governance regeneration on an ongoing basis. And that will help focus the mind, I do think. I do think it's important that, we can get into the habit of saying, oh, well, that's the board's problem, or that's, that recruitment's an operational issue, or that volunteer gap is for that committee to deal with. But we need to think about it more collectively and to make the most of, I suppose, all of our network connections, all of our own individual resources. I think one of the things I often think that comes into mind is, it's that old phrase, if you want something done, ask a busy person. So I also think something similar applies with volunteers. If you want to recruit new volunteers, maybe approach other voluntary organizations, have information evenings with them, try and, engage with them to say, can we present to your group to show the benefits of volunteering with the credit union? What you find as volunteers are a very specific breed unto themselves. And they, the people who volunteer are quite driven in that sense. And I think if they volunteer in one area, it's quite common for them to volunteer in other areas. And they might have very disparate interests that are filled by the different volunteering elements. And look, sometimes volunteers naturally evolve out of some of their volunteer roles and they're looking for something new, something for themselves maybe. A lot of people get involved in sporting groups because their children are involved, and then the children move on and their role diminishes. So it might be a new opportunity for them to remain in the volunteer arena, but do something a little different, but more challenging, to engage with people of like mind. Other elements of things like other options might be like full-time parents that are thinking of getting back into paid employment market. They could find volunteering on a credit union board as a way to ease themselves back into reading business documentation, attending meetings, undergoing training. These things, you know, are, I suppose, attractions that or things that may be attractions to certain people. So for another tranche is obviously people looking for career progression within the financial services sector, or for someone looking for a career change to move into the financial service sector. They could find that serving on a credit union board would be good for their career prospects. So these are the attractions we try to have to bring to people's attention. And I do think maybe that avenue of going through existing structures, existing groups within your community to reach people who are already like-minded, who are already community-oriented, might be a win-win. I do think once you've got a group, though, that are interested, or that you've attracted some attention from people who might be interested in volunteering, one of the key challenges I've often encountered is, how do you keep them interested? This has always been the challenge, because you may not have the vacancies immediately. You could be talking about a vacancy in 12 months' time, in 2 years' time, and so on. How do you keep them active and engaged? And I've spent a good bit of time thinking about this and trying to come up with maybe a different way that you could maybe approach it. This is just an idea. People all have their own ways of doing this, but I was thinking maybe about potentially treat a group of volunteers as a focus group from which vacancies are filled. It could be something that's based on regular meetings. Very important to have tea and nice biscuits, I might add. Not ad hoc. It needs to be regular. So whether it's monthly, quarterly, whatever the case may be, bi-monthly, that it's not a random, oh, we might meet, then again, we might not. It is about, you know, routine and structure, and people need to know what their commitments and how are and what arrangements they need to put in place in order to facilitate any activity like this. It could be an opportunity to offer and provide more formal training if individuals are interested within that group. It could be used to ease people into that training piece that we are going to need in credit unions to build confidence towards achieving minimum competency qualifications if necessary. But, you know, you can start off gently and work towards build confidence in people through this focus group piece. As and when vacancies arise, then you could present the details to the group and seek or approach volunteers for the more formal roles. Look, there's a few things in this, I think. Volunteers are usually interested in developing interests outside of their work and home commitments, or making a contribution to their community. I mean, that's what they're interested in. That's what they're willing and looking to do. It's important, I think, if this were to work, to ensure that everyone was aware that this particular group is intended to resource the board and committees as and when vacancies arise. Be clear at the outset, this is not an indefinite role of itself. If a directorship arises and a member of the group is not interested in ever moving into this role, while the credit union appreciates their effort and contribution to date, and should be clear on that, the purpose of this group would be to develop potential board nominees. So the place on this particular focus group would need to be offered to somebody else who might be interested in serving on the board in due course. And you could set the frequency to whichever, you know, best suits the credit union. And then, you know, at the point in time where a vacancy arises, if more than one volunteer, more than one of the focus group were to volunteer for a vacancy on the board or committee, then the selection criteria would include the standard ones that are, you know, are in place for credit unions, including gender, skills, competencies, experience, knowledge, length of service in the focus group, etc., for the specific vacancy arising. The nomination committee really should gather all those details from the outset, not just when the vacancy arises, because I think that would minimize the risk of offending people. You're basically saying, you know, at this point, there's a vacancy on the board. We're looking at certain characteristics, certain skills and knowledge. It's not simply because you've been in there the longest. It could be for a number of other factors that, based on the skills and competencies analysis, this is a better fit for this person than that person. So it is about gathering that at the beginning so that you're not offending people who have, you know, put the time and effort in to date. I would think for this focus group, and again, be careful, this is not a committee. We're being very clear here. This is not a committee. This is a focus group of individuals, of interested persons. A sample agenda might include something like updates on the status of the credit union. So you could have slides, on the performance, how the credit union is doing. You discuss possible strategic initiatives to get member feedback. So you could say, look, as a representation of our community, these are the things we're thinking about. What are your views? You could look for feedback on their own experiences with the credit union, what services they currently engage with, what services they might like in the future. You could invite different members of staff or volunteers to chat to them, either informally about their different roles in the credit union, or to make a presentation if they're more comfortable with that. It would depend on the preference of the individuals and the role, maybe. You could engage in group training on specific credit union topics. And again, that might help maybe overcome the nervousness or anxiety around getting back into more formal training. So there's lots, as we all know, lots of different training opportunities available for credit unions. Some are easier to ease into than others. And you could have a member of the nomination committee present at these sessions to identify those skills and competencies that they're looking for particular roles that they're looking to fill in the future. An idea could be that the lifespan of this focus group could be limited from the outset. For example, you could say we're looking to engage, a group for 6 or 12 months. And being definitive from the outset means that the credit union won't be under pressure as to what to do with the same people year after year. So it may well be that that each time you convene this focus group is for a fixed period. And that might, I think, maybe help with two things. Firstly, people might not feel as pressured to make such a long-term commitment from the outset, because as we know, when volunteers, for example, go to election onto a board, it's this kind of, you're elected for 3 years. It doesn't mean you have to serve 3 years, but the perception is it's for a 3-year period. So that might be off-putting for certain individuals. Taking people onto this, focus group for 6 or 12 months might get them over that initial anxiety that they're not having to commit indefinitely. Also, then, once the fixed period has expired, you could but you could ask them maybe to fill in an expression of interest form if they would like to be considered for nomination to the board in due course. It's really important to sum all of this up by saying, keep it sociable. I mean, I do think that's one of the elements that people look for when they're looking to volunteer, when they're looking to engage with like-minded people on a professional or semi-professional basis, in the sense of, making a contribution, giving something back to their community. But at the end of the day, it does need to be enjoyable. They need to get something out of it at a personal level. And it could be people coming back into a work situation, having been out of it for some time. And it's that connection that's going to be important. Hence why I stress the whole tea and biscuits bit, and anything else that's going to make it, that little bit more enjoyable at a personal level. I guess the key thing to say is, this is not maybe, this is not a possibility in the future. Those consequences that we were hoping wouldn't materialize lie just ahead. The deadlines, the elements that we were thought might materialize, and have materialized to a large degree, and we need to start dealing with them. To summarize, I guess, from everything that I've kind of covered today, the 6 steps of the process are identify the required skills and competencies to achieve the goals, document them, so create your current skills and competencies matrix for the credit union, analyze them, perform your skills gap analysis, plan, develop your plan from steps 1 to 3, document it, update it, keep it fresh, recruit if necessary, either employees and or volunteers, depending on where your gaps are, and engage. Keep the volunteers interested as best you can. I did try, but I couldn't come up with any decent acronym. So I'm afraid it is identify, document, analyze, plan, recruit, and engage. I couldn't think of any way to make this into a fancy word or into a word that you'd remember. But look, it's not a long list, hopefully. So just to, before I kind of put it, and I will go back, I see there's a question or two have popped in. Just to say, there is CPD for today's session. ILCU has awarded 1 hour for governance only in the ROI, because as we know, in the ROI regulatory environment, it's difficult to get operations hours for this type of topic. The Northern Ireland attendees, you get 1 hour for operations and governance with that particular code. The Institute of Bankers has awarded 1 hour for the Licentiate of Compliance Institute and 1 hour for the Fellow of Compliance Institute. I have applied for LIA accreditation, but again, that will be credit union hours only, assuming that they do award it, and that's in the process at the moment. So, oops, what have I done? Skipped ahead. Any other questions? Let me have a quick dip into the Q&A section again. Oh no, yes, they're the same questions that I've already addressed. Yeah. Sorry, yes, there's a last comment there about it would not be 2026 for a director who came in as part of a TOE. 12 years runs from the date of the TOE. Yes, and that's very specific circumstance where you have a board of directors where a credit union merged into an existing, all their existing credit unions, but the credit union, the moving in, their service starts again. The people who are already in situ for the credit union who's absorbed the board who are absorbing, usually smaller credit unions, not necessarily, but usually the one who's absorbing credit unions, their service continues, but the ones that are coming in from the credit union being absorbed into the entity, their service restarts from the date of the TOE. So I should have been clear on that one. That is an exception. Having templates for skills analysis. It's not that complicated in the sense that if you look at the different elements that are on that list on that slide, it's literally about documenting them and then applying a scoring mechanism. You can say if you go from the 1 to 5, you can apply a scoring to that. It's a fairly simple Excel spreadsheet process. But I mean, to be honest, yeah, if you like, I can put that on a list of things to do, as they say. I have a lovely to-do list. Skills analysis template. Okay. Any other questions? All the questions that I've seen so far. Yeah. You got something out of today's session, if only to kind of dust off where you may have gotten to before, figure out what currently works, what's not working, what you can do to help those who are struggling to meet this succession challenge, whether it be operationally or governance wise. There are challenges in all directions. So, you know, please do reach out if you want to have a chat further on any of those elements that I mentioned today. Thanks, Trish. I think unless there are any more questions, we can finish up on that. I just wanted to say thank you so much for everybody today for taking the time to attend, to ask questions, to hopefully refresh in the mind where you need to be or what needs to happen next. As I say, you know where we are in calculus. If there's anything that we can do in terms of guiding you through this, help from any of those aspects that came up in the presentation today, do let us know. And hopefully we shall speak to you all again soon. I'll stay online for another couple of minutes in case anything pops up, in case anybody thinks of a question at the last minute. And I hope you all have a good day and a good week, and that, you know, year end and the AGM process all goes very smoothly for you for the next over the next few months. Thanks, everyone.